Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at care for the aging in our continuing study of biblical ethics. A survey was done quite a while back where a group of resumes were sent out and job applications made, and the only difference was in the age of the person that was applying for the job. And that and overwhelmingly, it was at least a 2-to-1 margin that employers favored hiring the young person who had identical circumstances. Who is more likely to get hired for a job? The way we view the elderly, um, both in that area and in so many areas, is quite telling. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 29 says, "The glory of young men is their strength, and the honor of old men is their gray hair." Notice that honor is something that is supposed to come, at least back in the ancient world, with age. And it's becoming less and less honorable in our day and age that have a culture of youth. Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 32 says, "You shall rise up before the gray-headed and honor the aged, and you shall revere your God. I am the Lord." That's part of a whole series of commands. Each one says, "I am the Lord." In other words, these are important commands. I'm giving you these. But notice one of the commands was to honor the aged one, to revere them, to honor them, because we worship the Ancient of Days, the one who was without age, who has been around forever and ever. Proverbs 16, verse 31. A gray head is a crown of glory. It is found in the way of righteousness. And so there's something special about getting older and about exhibiting that sort of crown. Proverbs 17, verse 6. Grandchildren are the crown of old men. And not all old people have grandchildren. I'm fortunate to be able to be one of those who has such a crown. Grandchildren are the crown of old men, and the glory of sons is their fathers. And so there's something special about those old age years that can be absolutely wonderful. Titus chapter 2, Titus gives a number of instructions. He says, older men, in chapter 2, verse 2, older men are to be temperate, dignified, sensible, sound in faith, in love, in perseverance. He goes on to say, in the next verse, older women likewise are to be reverent in their behavior, not malicious gossips, nor enslaved to much wine, teaching what's good, so that they may encourage. Notice, one of the things that older women are to be doing is encouraging younger women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be sensible, pure, workers at home, kind, being subject to their own husbands, so that the word of God will not be dishonored, so that older women have a ministry within the church that is involved in training up younger women. 1 Timothy chapter 3 begins in verse 1, "Do not sharply rebuke an older man, but rather appeal to him as a father. To the younger men as brothers, the older women as mothers, the younger women as sisters, in all purity." But notice there's a place of honor toward the elderly. Paul goes on in the same chapter to say, "Honor widows, who are widows indeed." In other words, those who, and notice, he describes this: if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family, and to make some return to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God. So that the church had a ministry of assisting those who were befit, who were widows and could not support themselves, but if they had children or grandchildren, those children or grandchildren were to care for them. But verse 5, "Now she who was a widow indeed," in other words, one who was a widow and did not, for whatever reason, did not have children or grandchildren, and who's been left alone, and has fixed her hope on God and continues in entreaties and prayers day and night, That's one who's really destitute, who really is a widow. Verse 6, but she who gives herself to wanton pleasure, by contrast, is dead even while she lives. Prescribe these things as well, so that they may be above reproach. So he says in verse 8, but if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. We are called to take care of our family, and yes, our extended family. Verse 9, a widow is to be put on the list. Now that's where they were to care for that widow, the church itself, not just the family, because they didn't have any family. But here's a widow who's a widow indeed, a true widow. A widow is to be put on the list only if she's not less than 60 years old, having been the wife of one man, having a reputation for good works, and if she's brought up children, and if she's shown hospitality to strangers, if she's washed the saints' feet, if she has assisted those in distress, if she has devoted herself to every good work. In other words, she's done what she could do in her time, and now it's time for others to take care of her, which is a call that makes sure that you're living your life in such a way to have done these sorts of things, to bring up your children and to show hospitality to strangers and to care for believers and to assist those in distress. Verse 11, but refuse to put younger widows on the list, for when they feel sensual desires in disregard of Christ, they want to get married. And it's not that getting married is a bad thing, but this is evidently some sort of case where there were those women who were going to devote themselves, who were going to commit themselves, in a sense, were going to be devoted as though they were a wife to Christ. And someone who would now leave that, thus incurring condemnation, because they've set aside their previous pledge. This evidently involved what was seen to be a pledge, that they would give themselves over to the work of the Lord and therefore be supported by the church. Verse 13, at the same time, they also learn to be idle, and they go around from house to house, and not merely idle, but also gossips and busybodies, talking about things not properly mentioned. And so this was to be avoided. Verses 14, 15, therefore I want the younger widows to get married. Notice remarriage is okay and is desirable, and in this case to bear children and keep house and give the enemy no occasion for reproach, for some have already turned aside to follow Satan. And so that singleness after marriage can be a bad thing, and that remarriage can be a desirable thing. Verse 16, if any woman who is a believer has dependent widows, she must assist them, and the church must not be burdened, so that it may assist those who are widows indeed. And so notice that family obligations should trump, family obligations should come to the forefront, and we're called to take care of our families.